The construction industry is one of the most critical industries globally, over $11 trillion in value, yet it has significantly lagged in tech adoption.
What I would say is in the last 10 or so years, what really kicked it off was bringing smart devices into the construction site.
What do you think has been the primary challenge in adoption? Is it the cultural limitations, or has it been cost consideration, or has it been lack of data, or to ensure interoperability, or what exactly is the reason why we have not seen the kind of penetration?
The saying tends to be, if it's not broke, why do I fix it, right? Or why do I need to change it, right? The reason why we're seeing some of that adoption is purely just based on change of leadership, and it tends to be this next generation. They may have grown up around computers, they know a little bit more about data, they're coming into leadership positions, and now they're saying how do we compete in this changing world?
Are you excited about, say, modular and 3D printing, and do you think we are at an inflection point with regards to these two?
So as a builder, I'm very excited.
Yeah.
From talking to folks here in India, a lot of people are just more excited about technology. And they're like, I think a 3D printed home is cool. Whereas in the US, I think there was almost this I don't know if it'll work. It's a little bit more risk averse in some sense. So I think cultural differences and demographics definitely play a part of how we looked at that investment.
If you had to say what's top 2 or 3 solutions which excite you the most, what would they be?
I've been a fan of robotics for a really long time. And when you think about construction spend, 50% of construction spend is on labor. And then on the AI front, I think there's a massive opportunity for just automating a lot of, manual workflows that people don't really want to do. The challenge with that, though, is it's almost just getting too easy to build software. And I don't know, I feel like here in India, it's always been fairly easy to build software in the sense that there's a lot of software talent and it's pretty inexpensive to build software here.
Hi, in today's episode, we have Alice Leung. Alice is an expert in the construction tech industry. She is a principal at Brick Mortar Ventures, one of the renowned VC firms in the US. She also brings in a depth of industry expertise with a prior stint at DPR Constructions, which is one of the leading general contractors based out of the US. She also leads the accelerator program called Formwork Labs, which is a part of Brick Mortar Ventures. So thank you for joining, Alice. So the idea of bringing Alice today's discussion was to bring in our expertise from the US perspective. And now that Brick Mortar Ventures is also investing in the Asian markets, so to bring a global perspective of what's happening in the industry. So glad to have you today, Alice. So the question, I would like to start off with a very fundamental thought, I would say, and a fundamental fact that the construction industry is one of the most critical industries globally, over $11 trillion in value, yet it has significantly lagged in tech adoption. And despite billions of dollars being poured in the industry, it remains one of the least penetrated sectors in terms of tech adoption. And we've had challenges, from the builder's side, from the contractor's side, where adoption has been slow. But having said that, in the last 10 years, we've seen, solutions such as project management solutions, or you name like the material marketplaces. They've grown, they've proven scale. So what has changed over the years, and why penetration has been slow as per you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, first, thanks for having me here, Diraj. This is such a fun way to kick off a week in Bangalore. So I've been in the construction industry for, say, a little over a decade now. So not super long, but I've heard a lot of stories about how it was before and, back in the days when we were using, light tables and that type of stuff for coordination. But what I would say is in the last 10 or so years, what really kicked it off was bringing smart devices into the construction site. So for a very long time, everything was very much paper-based. And honestly, today, it's also still pretty paper-based depending on what the workflow is. And frankly, when you think about it, it really just depends on what is the easiest way to get information into the field, back out from the field. And sometimes it just doesn't make sense to use kind of digital tools, right? You still see a lot of paper on the construction site because sometimes it's just easier to write something on a piece of paper, put it in your pocket, go do whatever you need to do, write it, back when you're complete, and then bring it back into the office. So I don't think there's kind of a lack of interest in adopting technology. I think part of it is we may just not necessarily have the technologies that make it easy for us to do that yet. So now I think the really exciting part is sensors are getting a lot cheaper. So the ability to do either passive data collection or just the ability to kind of capture information in a different way is really helping change that. And even the last 5, 10 years with a lot of, applications that can get built, I think that's kind of helping with that. And, as more and more technologies get developed and as the price points come down, I think we'll see a lot more change.
Got it. But what do you think has been the primary challenge in adoption? Is it the cultural, limitations, or has it been cost consideration, or has it been lack of data, or to ensure interoperability, or what exactly is the reason why we have not seen the kind of penetration? For example, we've seen in fintechs of the world, we've seen agri-tech in India has grown significantly. We've seen fintech, which started more than a decade ago, has done phenomenally well. But why construction industry has been left behind? And also, I would like to state a very shocking fact, rather. So the other day, I was reading about it. As per a McKinsey report, while the global economy has grown about 3.5% over the last 2 decades, the construction industry has seen just 1% productivity growth, which is pretty abysmal, right? And for an industry which is as critical to any country's GDP, what's been the limiting factor for adoption? Because you've seen things from a industry perspective, being with a general contractor, and now you're seeing things from a VC perspective.
Yeah, so construction for almost every construction project, it's a pretty long supply chain of people that come together to work
Yeah.
on it. I think one big challenge is when you're thinking about technologies for
Yeah.
a project, you almost have to think about technologies for the entire supply chain, and you almost have to think about how do I either bringing a piece of technology for one part of the supply chain, but then of course that could also have a beneficial factor for a different part of the supply chain. So when you think about that, you almost have to build technology for multiple customers, right? Multiple
Right.
users on site. So I think a lot of it just has to do with the way that the supply chain is set up and how hard it is to do a one size fits all. There's really no one size fits all technology
Yeah.
for any given project, and every project is so different, right? So in some sense, the more that we can kind of standardize processes across projects or construction companies, I think that'll make it a lot easier. But if you talk to any big contractor, they will tell you that from project to project, all the workflows are different, processes are different, and even just the selection of technologies that people like to use and implement on site are very different.
Got it. But have you seen the larger contractors being more, you know, amenable to sort of adopting or embracing technology versus the smaller players, or, the mid players not being so forthcoming?
So I wouldn't necessarily say it's size driven. I
Okay.
think the biggest trend that we've seen in the US, European, and frankly, even in the Asian markets is almost this transition of leadership. And I think it's just a generational thing
Yeah.
where, right now, a lot of the people who are kind of high up in a company, the ones that are running the shots, the saying tends to be, if it's not broke, why do I fix it, right? Or why do I need to
Got it.
change it, right? So I think because of that kind of culture, and there is some of that, like, I don't want to take on the risk to try something new if it fails, right? So the reason why we're seeing some of that adoption is purely just based on change of leadership, and it tends to be, this next generation, they may have grown up around computers, they know a little bit more about data, they're coming into leadership positions, and now they're saying like, how do we compete in this changing world, right? And those people have kids that are now ChatGPT all the time, right? Whether or not it's good or bad, but it is this new type of technology that's kind of infiltrating their lives, and they're realizing that, hey, we need to be a part of that. And if we don't change, others are going to adopt and they're going to be able to compete and win.
Yeah. Actually, we are seeing that's a very fair point, and we are seeing a similar trend in, for example, India as well. The second gen who is taking over the business, right? The second or the third gen, they are more, excited about technologies. Hey, how I can improve my top line, or how I can reduce my cost. So overall, my balance sheet looks better, my operations are more efficient, I can deliver projects on time, etc. So very valid point. We're seeing a very similar trend in India as well. Um, Now moving on, like, and tying to your previous point, one very fundamental problems across construction companies, whether it's builders, everyone's complaining about labor issues, right? Whether and I've started to realize, even with during our conversations, I've started to realize it's not just limited to particular geography, but it's across geographies. So what do you think could aid in addressing some of this? Is it robotics, or because robotics, for example, has always been 5 years away for decades, right? So, what do you think could be a solution to this? Is it bringing in efficiencies? Because robotics has not taken off yet to an extent we would like to see. But having said that, there are green shoots, and we've seen a lot of adoption in robotics for solutions such as, say, painting and plastering services, materials movement on sites. So we've seen those green shoots, but what would be your take on this?
Yeah, so I think this is definitely a multifaceted approach. We do have to do robotics. We have to do upskilling.
Yeah.
We have to augment our workers.
Yes.
We also have to get into prefabrication. We need to do a little bit more kind of verticalizing the supply chain. We need, new materials. We need, there's so much that we can do, or so much that we need to do, actually. But I think one thing that a lot of people don't really talk about is necessarily how do we even just convince more people to join the industry, right? And
Got it.
this is something that I'm very passionate about because my and I think some people may have heard this, but my dad is a carpenter, and growing up, he always told me, and actually all my siblings as well, he was like, go get a college education, don't go into any type of work that's physical labor. And I think a lot of not just Americans, but I'm sure around the world, there's almost this kind of negative view on people that are doing kind of physical labor work or anything that's kind of blue collared. But the reality of it is, union electricians get paid a lot of money, more so than, anyone that's, a lot of entry level jobs in tech. And I think there's almost this marketing that we need to do around the construction industry where, as the world changes and, there's still such a huge lack of housing, there's a lack of shelter, there's so much need for physical space, and us as a human population can't grow without infrastructure, and there's a lot of infrastructure spend that's happening here in India. So there's a lot of excitement going into that, but you know robotics and all of these other innovations to the supply chain, that's not going to happen for another 5, 10, 15 years, right? That's not kind of a near term kind of thing. But what we can do is encourage more kids that are either in middle school or in high school, or kind of, getting to an age where they're deciding, what do I do with my career? Not everyone can become a TikTok influencer or, whatever, right? I think
Yeah.
in the US, 1 in 4 young people want to become TikTok influencers. We can't all do that. And the reality of it is, in this physical world, we need physical labor still. So within the short term or within the next decade, we still need a lot of people that kind of understand how physical things happen in the world, how to
Yeah.
put stuff together. So there's a lot of really great career opportunities there. And that's all going to change over time too, as we adopt more robotics or as we do more prefabrication or we get into more manufacturing. A lot of those workers are not going to be out in the fields kind of physically doing the work.
Yeah.
They're going to start operating equipment, so new types of equipment. They're going to be operating robotics, or they're going to help maintain robotics, or they're going to work in a factory, a prefabrication factory, right? So I think a lot of those roles are going to change, but I do think we almost have to kind of have a little bit of like a marketing campaign on why you should join the construction industry, not even just as blue collar work but also white collar work. There's a lot of people on the project management side that there's just is enough people coming into that space just because the how people view the construction industry tends to be so negative. But it's so necessary to all of the economies around the world, right? It's a big portion of GDP. It's a big opportunity. And we just need a lot more people kind of understand that in construction, there is tech, there is robotics. It's exciting. We're building physical things. And you can make a really good career out of it.
Yeah. Oh, it's a very interesting point you brought about, where everyone's talking about automation and replacing labor, but I think the priority should be upskilling labor and encouraging more people to sort of join the industry, right? And then followed by the other technologies such as robotics, modular construction, also 3D printing for that matter. So, in terms of modular and 3D printing, do you think we are at an inflection point where the industry says, okay, we are ready to adopt, this is something exciting? Because in India, just to give a uh, fact, that the government of India used modular construction for mass affordable housing projects, and they have demonstrated that this can be used. Of course, there are challenges which come with it for us to democratize, such as the biggest challenge is if you're making something in a factory, to transport it. I think the logistics remain some of the biggest challenges. But apart from that, I think it is very promising, at least from terms of democratizing it in the future, and sort of ensuring that the labor shortages are addressed to some extent. And secondly, the 3D printing aspect of it. While we may not be able to do high rise, etc., but for villa projects, for low rise structures, for say bus shelters, army bunkers, it's proven to be very effective, efficient, and also it solves the problem, right? So, are you excited about say modular and 3D printing? And do you think we are at an inflection point with regards to these two?
Yeah. So as a builder, I'm very excited.
Yeah.
And with modular construction, I think the world needs it, right? But I
Yeah.
think where we're at today, and I think this is a little bit more looking at the US market, and I spent a couple of years working in Singapore.
Yeah.
Modular construction was still more expensive than doing your normal stick-built construction.
Okay.
But this was maybe, 5, 10 years ago. And I think it really just depends on what is the labor costs in whatever region that you're working in, and also logistics, as you mentioned, is really challenging.
Yeah.
Logistics, transportation, in certain parts of the world, right? You may have to close off, multiple roads to
Yeah.
transport something that's been prefabricated. Or I guess you mentioned modular specifically. I would say I'm a bit more bullish on prefabrication in the sense of maybe prefabricating smaller pieces. I think modular volumetric has for a long time been a challenge just because of that logistics piece.
Yeah.
Some people say like, oh, you're transporting, a lot of air, right? Because it's a giant module, but
Yes.
inside it's very
It's hollow.
empty.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if you do prefab flat pack, there's, a lot of opportunities to kind of transport that, in at least in the US, the intermodal shipping network that works. You don't have to pay additional fees. You don't have to have highway escort and that type of stuff. Um, so I think we're getting there with prefabrication, and I think people just almost have to uh, productize and then also think about the entire kind of end to end from initial design through fabrication in the factory, logistics, install, and all that. And I think there just hasn't been a lot of people thinking about it from end to end because in the past, what we have seen is a lot of construction companies have decided that, oh, we want to, do prefab or we want to do this. And they don't necessarily think about the entire supply chain in some sense. They're just like, oh, let's just do it because we know it'll be
Yeah.
better or something like that, right? But I think we are getting a lot smarter at that, especially given, at least in the US market, there's been a lot of venture-backed plays, huge venture-backed plays, the famous one being 𝐶𝐻𝐿, right?
Yep.
So there's been a lot of education that has come out of, it's like venture subsidized education is kind of what I
Yeah.
call it. We do have a lot of that in the US market.
Yeah.
So I think it's just a matter of time when that ends up getting, a lot better from a kind of process and it becomes more mainstream. On the 3D printing side, it's definitely an area of interest. For us at Brick and Mortar, we've looked at that landscape for a really long time. And one of the early investments that we made in our first fund was Branch Technology doing 3D printed facades. And at that time, there's a really challenging portion of doing 3D printing for structural pieces, just because of the strict requirements around the US jurisdictions and finding structural engineers that we're actually comfortable with signing off 3D printing as a kind of structural method of construction. I think that's definitely changing. One of our newest investments is Twasta here in India. And the really exciting thing about that one is, there has been a good amount of time that has passed. And the team there, they are experts in 3D printing, and they know kind of end to end how everything works, from understanding the printer side through to material science. So they've understood a lot of those challenges. And frankly, when we underwrote that deal, we actually looked at, the global view of 3D printing, not just the US market. Because in the US, a lot of people, they don't buy concrete homes. They buy wood frame homes or metal stud framed homes. And it's just a weird cultural thing where they don't buy concrete homes. But in Asia and a lot of parts of the world, I see like people go and knock on the walls to for the sense of like sturdiness or whatever it is. But I think the parts of the world where Twasta is focusing on, it makes a lot of sense with the what they're building, how they're building it, the price point. And honestly, I just feel like, from talking to folks here in India, a lot of people are just more excited about technology. And they're like, I think a 3D printed home is cool. Whereas in the US, I think there was almost this like anti, oh, like, I don't know if it'll work. It's like a little bit more risk averse in some sense. So I think cultural differences and demographics definitely play a part
Got it.
of how we looked at that investment.
Got it. And which also explains why, although it's been around for a while in the US at least, but we've not seen it democratized, right? And being like a mass adoption as well. So is that so? Is that the reason why we have not seen it achieve critical mass?
I think part of it is cultural. And if you've seen some of the early 3D printed homes, like 5-ish years ago, they kind of looked like concrete huts. And I think people it just didn't look like a normal home, right? And I think a lot of people just didn't have kind of appreciation for that technology.
Understood.
So I think it is definitely a cultural thing. Like, I think if, because Twasta is working with people in the US today, and they are getting projects and they are getting traction. So I think part of it was also just trying to figure out, how do you use this type of technology to kind of build the customer what they want, rather than forcing a new type of product that the
Got it.
customer may not fully understand.
Got it. And also, is it also the cost consideration? Is it tends to be slightly more, premium compared to the traditional means of construction. But of course, there's a set off. You tend to finish the project much advance, right? You do it. You save about 50 to 60% on your project timelines. Just the structure and everything. So, does the cost set off with the time?
So in the US market, this is where, because the US is so big, you actually have to look at what region you're building in,
Got
and you have to do the calculation of labor cost. So if you're building in a very high cost of labor market like San Francisco, New York, or Boston, a lot of the times, and not just 3D printing, but prefabrication makes sense, because you're saving the labor cost in the field to do that install.
Understood.
So around the US, it really just depends on, labor costs, material costs, and then a little bit of that, like, okay, do I want to take on the risk of trying something new?
Understood. Okay. But a very interesting point, though, which means, if I had to summarize it, which means that a prefab is already, we have seen a lot of use cases in prefab. Modular is getting there, and 3D printing is emerging and appears to be very promising. And also, for the benefit of our viewers, 3D printing is basically a technology which uses additive manufacturing, and it deposits layer or by layer, it deposits concrete in a layer by layer format to literally print homes. I mean, if I had told this, say, about 10, 15 years ago, that you could print homes, you might be wondering, what am I talking? But that's possible today with, the advent of 3D printing technology. And yeah, I mean, I think the point of view was very helpful, what you mentioned, and drawing parallels between the US and India as well. Because we've seen, like, the army bunkers which are used across the Indian borders. We've seen immense amount of 3D printing being used there. Second is for the healthcare facilities and which has to come up, say, in a very short span of time. They've been able to do that. Leisure homes, villas, they're being built at record timelines with 3D printing. At least we've seen a lot of pilots, and now we are looking at a much deeper adoption as well. So pretty interesting things happening out there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And moving on to the other part of the conversation, um, if we look at the construction tech background or the landscape, what has worked in India is the materials. The biggest thing what has worked is the materials, which also explains why companies like Infradot Market are market leaders and the largest valued prop tech company in India, prop tech slash construction tech company in India. We've seen the likes of project management, you know, and digital contractors, which such as Brick and Bolt and few others, which have done relatively well, which are basically plugging in the inefficiencies during the construction process, and also addressing things like productivity and managing end to end of any project, which is basically challenging because you have a lot of moving parts. You don't know who the contractors are, how they're working, and all of that. So there tends to be a lot of challenges of and interoperability issues as well during construction. So those have been doing well. And but apart from that, maybe robotics to very minor extent for plastering and painting. And yeah, that's about it. I think there are just few ones. What about the US landscape? We've seen likes of Procore, maybe Matterport. How do you see the, how do you see the industry evolving then? What kind of, if you had to say what's top two or three solutions which excite you the most, what would they be?
Yeah, so in the US market, we've seen a lot of just pure digitization in the last 10 or so years. And that's purely just I'm going to take a paper-based process or some, current workflow and purely just digitize it. And in some sense, there really hasn't been much of like process improvement. It's kind of just like, okay, instead of doing it by paper, I'm going to do it digital. So I would say like there is still an opportunity for some of that in the US market, but I just don't think we're seeing as much of a like efficiency gain by doing some of that pure digitization. I've been a fan of robotics for a really long time, and when you think about, construction spend, 50% of construction spend is on labor. Um, so when it comes to you know, how do we build faster? How do we build more? I do think we need to augment a lot of the workers in the field with new equipment, new robotics, new materials, and all that. But of course, in the US market, the big challenge there is the capital intensive nature of a lot of those types of
Yeah.
businesses. The really encouraging thing is the cost to develop or test out new materials or to build early prototypes for robotics is drastically coming down, and the timelines are just getting way shorter. And I think a lot of this is thanks to AI. So on the AI front, I think like that's exciting. And then on the AI front, I think there's a massive opportunity for just automating a lot of manual workflows that people don't really want to do. The challenge with that though is it's almost just getting too easy to build software. And I don't know, I feel like here in India, it's always been fairly easy to build software in the sense that there's a lot of software talent and it's pretty inexpensive to build software here. In the US market, software talent is still fairly expensive. Though there's a lot of people that are, leveraging overseas talent for software engineering. But selling kind of software automation is still very challenging in the US market just because I think there's a lot of egos at play and there's a lot of people who, still think that like a computer cannot outsmart me or a computer can't do XYZ accurately. And in some extent, like computers cannot replace the human just yet. And I don't think that'll be anytime super soon for construction just because of all the complexities in the supply chain and so much like decision making requires information and data from disparate sources. But from an automation perspective, I think the next generation of interesting companies that we'll see are probably like AI powered services. So it used to be kind of tech enabled services where people would build, you know, digital tools and digitize manual workflows to increase efficiency for the services that they're building. But the next generation is even, greater efficiency because you're automating a lot of that and not just digitizing. So I think the construction industry is definitely going to change a lot in the next like 5-10 years.
Got it. So if I had to summarize, it's basically the software which can ensure efficiencies across the processes. That's what you say, and embedded with AI, of course, AI and some fair bit of deep tech is what you think is going to lead the next wave of the innovation in the space.
That and robotics.
Robotics,
too.
of course, yeah.
Robotics and
Robotics.
materials. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'm hoping that it's finally the time for robotics,
Yeah.
but we do keep saying it's, the
Always.
next 5 years.
Yes.
5 years ago.
Yes. Oh, that's true. But also, since we mentioned robotics in India, the reason why we've not seen it work the way it should work is because of the labor cost arbitrage.
Yeah.
And because labor is still relatively inexpensive in India. So there's no motivation to go and look out for, say, robotics today.
Yeah.
So we've not seen. But having said that, as I mentioned, robotics for high rises where you can ensure painting, plastering,
Yep.
that has relatively, I think that seems promising to me. And second thing is there's a lot of material movement that happens on site. So instead of deploying resources there, you could maybe take help of a robot and because that was quite shocking to me as well. Apparently, a considerable amount of time just goes in moving materials on site. So, of course, we could do with some automation there. So, yeah, I mean, that's what it is. And moving on, since you've been speaking to a lot of founders, I've been speaking to a lot of founders in this space. The biggest challenge they say is the sales cycle, right? Or rather the business cycle. When they approach builders, they say that okay, it takes months to even close a deal with builders. So which is, of course, as a founder, where as VCs we are on one end, we are pushing for scale, we are motivating them for faster growth, etc. But the real world challenges are that the adoption or the sales cycle tend to be longer, and unless you really sit down with the builders and solve for some real world challenges, understand their pain points, I don't think it's as simple as it is in other segments to just build something and just make sure it works. So do you see that similar phenomenon in the US as well, or and rather, what would be your advice to founders who are building in this space, because it's very easy to get demotivated because of such longer cycles?
Yeah. So construction basically runs on lower cost, right? So
Yeah.
when it comes to any type of decision making for a project, it's like, okay, how do we value engineer this? How do we make this cheaper? How do we do that?
Yeah.
And it's all about, 3 bids and then getting the lowest, so it's all so price driven that from a software perspective, in the last 10 years, the things that are really hard to sell are frankly these digitization tools, because how do you convince someone that they need some database to store information, right? There's no kind of tangible ROI to that. And I think, that has been the challenge, right? Those who see the value of data can understand that, right? I could use this data to do analytics and then understand, where do I need to make changes and stuff like that. But not everyone understands that in construction. And I think a lot of it just has to do with like, some people have been doing it for so long that they can see things and their brain is basically doing the data analytics, and
Yes.
they don't depend on something else to do it. So yeah, that was what was in the last couple of years or in the last decade or so. But the new types of technologies that we're seeing, it's almost easier and easier to understand ROI because a lot of it is automation focused. So,
Got it.
we've seen a lot of these takeoff solutions, and I'm sure you've seen them here as well. They're actually just popping up around the entire world. A lot of people have figured out that it takes a long time to go and count, doors and windows and, to measure lines of piping and all that, right? It's a very manual scope of work that takes a lot of time that you could very easily calculate, how long, or even look at past information, right? Like it took me, 10 hours to do these couple of sheets, right? Run it through the AI and then see how long it takes. So that's such a easy kind of ROI calculation that I think moving forward, as long as the new softwares and new technologies that come out, if you could have a very clear, like, this is the old way, this is a new way, we're saving you X, right? It's such an easy kind of calculation to do. And it's so obvious that, like, it's almost like, why wouldn't you try this
Got it.
technology?
So, in, rather than just focusing on the solution, you should also take that extra effort to sort of clearly articulate the ROI and make sure you pass on the message to your end users. I think that's what would work better because, of course, as a builder, if I'm able to reduce cost, then you have my attention. Otherwise, it gets difficult to get the message across the board.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you're saying that builders need to be, or rather, the founders need to be more patient and make sure they are while they are solving for these things and creating awareness. I think it's a patient game as well because it's inevitable, right? Because we are still building the way we used to build 20 years ago, still the old archaic ways.
Mhm.
But it's high time that disruption happens sooner or later. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what we saw about 10 years ago with kind of smart devices, so like iPads, smartphones, and all that, I do think we're seeing that today with a lot of these AI tools. And I always say ChatGPT, it may not necessarily be the best one,
Yeah.
but it is the one that's the most prevalent and it's the one that everyone knows about. So I think, on a consumer perspective, as more and more people in the supply chain, in the construction industry, like, learn about these technologies, then they're like, oh, wait, like, I could use that for my work side, right? So I think there's always going to be some, like, consumer facing driven thing
Yep.
that will then be the unlock because, when people get comfortable with it, that's when I think we'll see the adoption.
Yes, and also the numbers speak for itself. If we take the entire industry, it's $11 trillion industry. Even with a 5 to 10% efficiency, or if you're addressing it's imagine the TAM.
Yeah.
It's a $500 billion to $1 trillion TAM. I mean, if I were to start something today, I think it would be in this space because clearly there's a vacuum in the space and the TAM is, sky is the limit.
Yeah.
So definitely, I mean, I would build for that. So Alice, what is the one thing you would say is happening in, say, the US and the other global markets, but missing in India currently, especially with respect to construction tech startups and the landscape overall? What is that one trend you think should happen, or you see it happening over the term?
Yeah. I think one of the really cool things is when I visited Bangalore last year, I spent a lot of time talking to investors and startups and kind of feeling the energy. And it really felt like last year, it felt the same as when I first joined Brick and Mortar in the US market. Now it's like 6.5 years ago. So it just feels like like where India's at is kind of the start of, the entire kind of prop tech growth. And then you're starting to see some of the early kind of construction tech companies kind of come out and, really make a big impact. So thinking about it from that perspective, in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of corporate venture capital firms that have been set up in the US by whether it's material suppliers or general contractors, or even, design firms that have some type of like venture arm to kind of look at new technologies and things like that. We've seen this in the European market as well as in the US market. We saw a couple kind of more out of Singapore. I know there's a couple here in India, but not as kind of prevalent as it is in the US market. And I do think, there is this kind of maturity timeline of like the maturity of startups, the maturity of venture capital, the maturity of the industry. And then once all of that hits, then you're going to see kind of the corporate venture capital side wanting to get involved with the startup community, wanting to be kind of a part of that growth. And I think part of it is, when you look at some of the early and big exits from the construction tech space in the US, the PlanGrids of the world, there were a lot of contractors and individuals that were involved in making PlanGrid successful, but they got nothing when, PlanGrid got acquired by Autodesk, and there were these great exits for early investors, but the corporates and the individuals really didn't get anything. So I think part of that actually drove, some interest from the contractor side and getting involved with the startups. And then, of course, down the construction supply chain, there are other incentives such as, just, seeing so many startups come into play. These corporates were kind of not necessarily scared, but wanting to understand, what were some of those technologies that could potentially disrupt them.
Yeah.
Have the startups disrupted any of these, big players?
Yeah.
No, not yet. Will they? I think so. It's time for, new business models and a lot of that type of stuff. So I think here in the India market, just seeing kind of that initial growth, and I think it's actually growing and maturing a lot faster than
Yep.
construction tech did in the US market, especially given there's been so much kind of talent and, the GCCs have been here. There's a lot of like talents and people who already use and understand a lot of the technologies that are being used outside of India. So I can only see that kind of growth trajectory being a lot faster and just a lot more people coming into play.
That's a very good point that you made. It's essential for CVCs, or rather corporate venture capital, to participate in this growth, because what startups need today who are building in this space is that beyond capital, they need the strategic expertise and the help, because there's only so much you can do with capital if the adoption doesn't happen, right? So I think it's critical that the corporates come out there and help these startups as well, because unless adoption happens on a mass scale, because even in the US, you mentioned you've seen some of the larger contractors adopting BIM and other kind of technology, but today it's quintessential for the smaller players, like, or rather the tier 2 tier 3 builders, to adopt, because they make up the bulk of the market. Apart from the top 10-15 players, it's in order for for a solution to become widespread and achieve the kind of critical mass, it's important for the tier 2 and tier 3 builders to adopt them. So I think CVCs can play a very big role, because they also open doors to other customers as well.
Yeah, one of the biggest requests that we get from any startup, whether it's like, pre-seed stage through Former Labs or even up to, seed and Series A, it's always access to customers. So, access to customers from both a like feedback, product roadmap, and like what to build perspective, as well as access to customers from a kind of revenue and growth perspective. So I think the big opportunity for whether it is or is not CVCs or even just corporates, corporates do have a big hand to play in kind of this ecosystem. And, if you are going to spend time with those startups, you may as well, put some investment in and try to get some of that upside.
Yeah.
True. From this conversation, I think for me, if I were to build today and wear the hat of a founder, I would bet on 3D printing, and second, something which helps me detect deviations during construction, or helps you do a contractor reconciliation with the help of something what likes of Matterport has done to some extent, use of LiDAR and those advanced technologies embedded with deep tech and AI. So I think something like that would be exciting, and of course 3D printing. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, along the lines of what you've mentioned, I think one big opportunity is still kind of connecting the physical world with the digital world. And that's both of the things that you mentioned, I think, have that.
Yeah.
Because, even if we have the best design, the best drawings, even if we had the best prefabricated parts, right? Unless if you accurately install it, or unless if you fully understand your site conditions, like there will still be issues. So I think, there's so much of that like connection with the physical world that's missing. And I think a big part of that is the technology may not be there yet, or the technology is still too expensive. So I think what really excites me is new sensor technology, new capture technology, like things that make it a lot less expensive. And I know there's a big, physical AI buzzword going on, and everyone's trying to figure out what physical AI is. I think for construction, we're still a long road away because like we just don't have that data anywhere, really. Like if you've done field capture, it's all in point cloud data in some like hard drive because it's too expensive to store it on the cloud or it's too big to store it on the cloud. So I think with that, we do need to like capture workflow, like physical workflows, capture how people are doing things, capture quality. Like there's still so much of capture that we need to do before we can even do a lot of the AI that, a lot of people really want. So yeah, I'm all about like linking digital and physical.
Got it. So the starting step to this is basically accumulating data and making sense of that data, right? Before you go out and venture and build something.
Yeah. Yeah, and we have in the construction industry, I feel like we probably have some of the most like outdated like file formats, the most complex data, because you're not just looking at like, PDFs and CAD files. You're also looking at, a lot of like handwritten, notes, hand sketches. You have point cloud data, you have Revit files, you also have your normal CAD files. You may have like Naviswork files, you may have all different types of file formats that, there's really no, like today, there's really no platform that ties all of that together. And so much of the building process, everything is location based, it's GIS based. So you need kind of the linking of digital to the real world. So yeah, it's complex, but I think there's a big opportunity.
Got it. Oh, it makes sense. And today, no conversation is complete without talking about or touching upon sustainability, right? Uh, and I firmly believe that based on what we are seeing today, that it's moving beyond boardrooms and people are actually talking about how to decarbonize and taking steps towards decarbonizing. We also seen, some of the builders come forward and set aggressive targets to decarbonize. So, with regards to construction, and what the data says is about 27% of the emissions come from operating a building, and about 13% come from the materials which go into the building. And of course, put together, real estate and construction happens to be a villain in terms of global greenhouse gas contribution. It contributes the highest amongst any other industry. So, what I would like to understand from you is, has material, adoption taken off yet? Because we've not seen any large scale, adoption, because maybe because of the inherent industry challenges or the cultural challenges, or the skepticism whether this is going to work, because we don't have any data points to prove that okay, this material has worked, because nothing has ever replaced concrete so far, right? So what is your point of view from that aspect?
Yeah, this one's a tough one being in the US because so much of the US is either, regulatory driven or it's cost driven. And, a lot of the times
It's pretty much everywhere, actually.
yeah, I guess in some sense, we have the lack of regulation driven right now. But, we do look at the European market and there's a lot of, like, they're making a lot of progress on that front, right? But in the US market, sadly, so much of it is still cost driven. And unless if, a client subsidizes the use of green materials or something like that, from a cost perspective, it's still more expensive to be sustainable. I mean, I think that's the sad truth of it. And one kind of big challenge, I think it's probably a challenge across the world, is, the decision making around even selection of materials or selection of equipment and stuff like that. Unless if on the client side, there is someone from the OpEx team that's a part of those conversations in early stages where everything is CapEx driven. I think a lot of the times, like the near term CapEx decision making is always around cutting costs. Whereas on the OpEx side, there are definitely certain pieces of equipment or certain design decisions where it may be more expensive from a CapEx perspective, but from an OpEx perspective, you're going to save a lot of money. But in a lot of those early design conversations, there's usually no one from the OpEx side that's there kind of, fighting for that. And so much of it is like just the way that it's set up, it's two separate budgets. And at the end of the day, each of those like business unit leaders or whoever you want to call it, they're incentivized to reduce their budgets. But what happens when, the two budgets are kind of, going against each other from a decision-making perspective? So I think that's a challenging part. And, when you look at the entire construction supply chain, there's so many challenges with, if I use this piece of equipment, maybe it's lower labor costs, but then some other player in the supply chain may actually see the cost savings. So much of this decision making and like how to position cost. But how you position it and how you have to think about it is like understanding the incentive structure for everyone involved with that one decision, and then trying to make sure that you could set it up in a way where it is hopefully win-win-win for everyone.
Got it. I think the European Union has made a lot of strides in that aspect. They've mandatorily enforced regulations which require buildings to be decarbonized by 2030. Rather, the new buildings, of course, because retrofitting, I think they've set a target of 2050. So, which is also aggressive in my opinion, but which is good. I think unless you enforce, as you said, everyone's just going to look at cost and it's never going to happen. It's going to be postponed to perpetuity. So it's not going to happen. And I think the last part of the conversation, how far do you think you've seen things, from the Asia perspective, from the US perspective? In the US, where do you see, the adoption of construction tech today? And relatively, we always, we see US as a benchmark in terms of adoption, and we feel we are a couple of years away, 4 to 5 years away. So where do you see US today, which will give also a sense into where India, or how long it's going to take for India to sort of truly achieve that kind of scale?
I think that's such an interesting question because, I think from a pure digitization perspective, I think the US has gone a pretty long way. And I kind of think about like there's multiple points in time where I think it's very interesting, right? In some sense, if you think about like just mobile phones, right? In some sense, India got to leapfrog a lot of stuff because of just the immediately fast adoption of mobile phones and apps, and you almost kind of skip the computer. So instead of like a lot of people using desktop programs and desktop applications, everyone's just doing everything on the phone, right? And you can get a lot done with just WhatsApp, frankly, right? So if I think about the US market,
sorry to interrupt, even the digital payments infrastructure though.
Exactly, there you go. We don't have that, right?
That way I think India is at least far ahead in terms of adoption in those aspects, but of course we've lagged in construction.
But then that's where it's like, I feel like in different nations, depending on how quote unquote, far behind you are, there's going to be leapfrogging opportunities. And in the US market, like a lot of people are digitized, a lot of people are using emails, they're using all this stuff, right? But one big challenge is actually getting them on mobile, right? So in some sense, like India construction has already beat out on so much of US construction because like everyone's just already connected through mobile. Whereas in the US, it's like a lot of people are connected through emails or project management solutions. And then like, you're using walkie-talkies to talk to people in the field. And there's also this kind of big thing on data privacy and privacy in general. So this is more of a cultural thing where like I worry that with all these concerns about privacy, we're actually going to lose on some of the other things. So one thing that I learned this year was there's a lot of equipment coming out of China, both like construction equipment as well as robotics. And their robotics is very inexpensive. Like a humanoid robot is $15,000 US. And if you look at any of the like super well-funded venture-backed humanoid robots in the US, they're still extremely expensive. I think like $40K for the cheapest one. And like there's some really hilarious videos online of like robots trying to like close a dishwasher but failing incredibly, right? So from a privacy and kind of that type of paranoia perspective, I think it's actually going to hold the US back on adopting some new equipment, some robotics and all that, just because of this fear that like China's going to have our site data, if I'm building like a, playground or something like that, I don't think that really matters. But if I'm building a government facility, obviously, there will be some privacy concerns. But for a lot of construction, if it's road work, like all that data is already captured in our satellites, right? Like if you wanted to hack construction data, it's all kind of already hackable. So I think this privacy thing is going to hold us back. And in a lot of other parts of the world where they may be okay with or they figured out, how to protect data or figure out, the privacy thing to adopt less expensive equipment and tools.
Yeah.
I think they're actually going to beat out the US market from that perspective. And I do think in India, with the excitement in robotics, and it's just a lot less expensive to build robotics and equipment here, that may be another angle where like the US is going to be left behind a little bit. And yeah, it sucks to say that kind of as an American and like being excited about construction in the US, but I'm hoping that the contractors don't care and they're like, well, if I'm just trying to do it the most inexpensive, efficient way, like I'm going to go buy the equipment from where I need to be able to offer that service.
Got it. So you're saying not necessarily we need to look at benchmarking any geography. Everyone plays to their own strengths, and you're seeing the winds of change in at least the Asian and the Indian markets. So we are not very far away from making it truly, achieve a critical mass for that matter.
Yeah, and I think like if you break down the world, like Europe, US, Australia, they kind of tend to have the same factors at play from a construction perspective because of like labor costs, the lack of labor, and a lot of that. But in different parts of the world, I think there's definitely advantages to be taken in, like that will kind of, and it's all just, every region has to figure out like what is their internal advantage and how do you take advantage of that to really make construction more efficient.
Got it. Because it also happens to a very local industry, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the regional aspects, regulatory, whether it's your, the climatic conditions, etc., play out for each of the regions individually.
100%. Yeah.
Great. I think I had an amazing conversation. I got to learn a lot. And again, it was great to have you on this show.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was so fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alice.